She was handcuffed right at her desk under the stunned and scornful stares of the entire office. A director shouted, "She leaked confidential files. She's a spy." No one knew the woman being led away in silence had graduated from Harvard Law and had spent the last 8 months secretly gathering evidence for the government. 3 weeks later, she returned no longer a contract assistant, but the key witness in the biggest money laundering prosecution in the financial industry. The Manhattan skyscraper gleamed under the morning sun, its glass facade reflecting the city's restless pulse. Inside the 34th floor office of Sterling and Holt, a top-tier financial law firm, the air buzzed with ambition. Lawyers in crisp suits darted between glass-walled conference rooms, their voices sharp with legalese, while assistants typed furiously at sleek desks. Grace Miller sat at the edge of the legal department, her white blouse tucked neatly into gray slacks, her brown hair pulled into a low ponytail. Her glasses perched on her nose, catching the fluorescent light. She reviewed contracts, her pen moving steadily across pages unnoticed by the power players striding past. Her desk tucked in a corner held a single photo frame, a faded picture of her parents at a community picnic, their smiles warm. To everyone else, she was just the quiet girl who filed papers. No one suspected she was anything more. The firm's hierarchy was rigid, its culture cutthroat. Partners barked orders, associates scrambled to impress, and appearances mattered as much as results. Grace's plain outfit, no designer labels, no flashy accessories, made her a target. Her colleagues in their tailored blazers and polished shoes shot her sideways glances, their lips curling slightly. She didn't fit the mold. She didn't wear the right brands or laugh at the right jokes. But Grace didn't care about their approval. She'd been raised by parents who valued integrity over status, who taught her to move quietly but purposefully. Her Harvard law degree earned through sleepless nights and sheer grit was tucked away in a drawer at home. Here she was undercover, her eyes sharp for every slip, every whisper of corruption in the firm's billion-dollar deals. Grace's morning started early, her desk piled with contracts by 7 "Ma." She scanned each clause, her pen marking inconsistencies, her focus unbroken. But the office didn't see her diligence. They saw her plain blouse, her scuffed flats, her lack of polish. One morning as she carried a stack of files to the boardroom, a senior associate named Claire, her blonde hair swept into a sleek updo, blocked her path. "Hey, you're Grace, right? Or is it Emily?" Claire said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Grab some coffee for the team, will you? Black, no sugar." Her manicured nails tapped her phone as she turned away, not waiting for a reply. Grace paused, her arms full of files, her expression calm. "I'll let the catering team know," she said evenly, her voice low but clear. Claire's friend, an intern in a sharp blazer, snickered. "God, she's like the secretary's assistant," he muttered loud enough for others to hear. The hallway echoed with soft laughs as Grace walked on her steps, steady, her fingers tightening briefly on the files. As Grace approached the elevator with her files, a paralegal named Jessica, her heels clicking sharply, leaned toward a colleague. "Look at her lugging those papers like a pack mule," she said, her voice carrying across the hall. "What's she even doing here? She looks like she's from some backwater office." Her friend, a junior lawyer with a flashy watch, laughed, his phone raised to snap a quick photo. "Bet she's here to fetch coffee for the real talent," he added, sparking chuckles from nearby desks. Grace's hands steadied on the files, her glasses glinting as she pressed the elevator button. "I'm delivering documents," she said, her voice calm but firm. Jessica smirked, tossing her hair. "Documents. Stick to photocopying, sweetheart." The laughter followed Grace into the elevator, the doors closing with a soft ding, her fingers brushing the edge of her blouse as she stood still. The boardroom was a fortress of glass and steel where partners sealed deals worth more than some countries' GDPs. Grace slipped in to deliver the files, her presence barely noticed. As she set them down, a director named Richard, his tie a bold shade of red, glanced up from his tablet. "Grace, or whatever your name is," he said, his voice sharp. "Make me a coffee, low sugar. The board's waiting." His colleagues, their eyes on their laptops, didn't even look up. Grace nodded, her face composed, and stepped out to the break room. She poured the coffee, her hands steady, her glasses catching the light. As she returned, the intern from earlier leaned against the doorframe, smirking. "Thought she was like the secretary of the secretary," he said to Claire, who laughed, her earrings glinting. Grace set the coffee down, her movements precise. "Anything else?" she asked, her voice calm. Richard waved her off without a glance. "Just don't mess up the files," he said, sparking a chuckle from the room. Grace left her shoulders straight, her clutch tucked under her arm. Grace paused by the break room, adjusting her glasses as she scanned a memo on the bulletin board. A group of associates gathered nearby, their voices loud and mocking. One, a man named Greg with a polished briefcase, pointed at her. "Check out her outfit," he said, his voice carrying over the hum of the coffee machine. "Did she raid her mom's closet from the 90s? His friends laughed, one woman twirling her designer scarf as she joined in. "She's probably here on a temp contract," she said, her phone raised to capture Grace's plain slacks. "No way she belongs in this office." The group's laughter swelled, drawing eyes from nearby cubicles. Grace's fingers lingered on the memo, her posture steady, her glasses glinting. "I'm here to work," she said, her voice low but clear. Greg snorted, leaning closer. "Work. Stick to fetching donuts, lady." Grace turned away, her steps even, but her fingers brushed the edge of her clutch, a quiet anchor in the storm. A junior attorney named Rachel, her badge pinned neatly to her blazer, approached Grace by the break room. "Miss Miller," she said quietly, holding out a small envelope. "I found this in the training files. It's a thank you from the pro bono team you helped last year." The envelope contained a card signed by clients Grace had assisted with contract reviews. Her fingers brushed the paper, her lips curving slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm. Rachel nodded, her eyes bright, and walked away. Greg, still lingering nearby, overheard his briefcase slipping slightly in his hand, his earlier smirk fading as he glanced at his friends who shifted uncomfortably. Grace's desk was her sanctuary, a small island in the chaos of the firm. She sat there now, her pen moving across a contract, her eyes scanning for errors. The document was dense, filled with clauses that hid risky loopholes. She spotted one in Clause 9. 3, a flaw that could cost the firm $40 million if signed. Her fingers paused, her breath catching slightly. She stood, smoothing her blouse, and walked to the boardroom. Knocking softly, she stepped inside. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady. "I noticed something off in Clause 9. 3. As written, it could cause serious financial loss to our side." The lead attorney, a man named Edward with silver hair and a sharp jaw, double-checked the clause, his face paling. "Richard," the director snapped, "who told you to touch executive documents?" His voice carried drawing eyes. Grace met his gaze, her glasses glinting. "I was trained to spot things like that," she said, her tone even. Edward nodded slowly, his pen circling the clause. "She's right," he muttered. Claire, standing nearby, rolled her eyes. "Lucky guess," she whispered to the intern, who smirked. Grace turned away. Her steps measured her fingers, brushing the edge of her slacks. As Grace left the boardroom, a senior partner named Victoria, her pearls gleaming under the lights, stopped her in the hallway. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she said, her voice low but venomous, drawing the attention of nearby associates. "One little catch doesn't make you one of us. Stay in your lane." Her colleagues, sipping coffee, smirked, one whispering to another, "She's probably Googling legal terms at night." The group's laughter echoed down the hall, sharp and relentless, as heads turned to watch. Grace's hand rested on her clutch, her posture steady, her glasses catching the light. "I'm just doing my job," she said, her voice calm but firm. Victoria scoffed, adjusting her pearls. "Your job? You're barely qualified to be here." Grace walked away, her steps even, but her fingers brushed the faded photo frame in her bag, a quiet tether to her purpose. The next day, Edward invited Grace to observe a meeting, a rare nod to her catch. She sat at the edge of the boardroom, her notepad open, her pen still. The discussion was heated, partners debating a merger worth billions. Grace listened, her eyes tracking every word, every gesture. Halfway through, a department head named Margaret, her pearls gleaming under the lights, turned to her. "This room is for executives only," she barked, her voice cutting through the debate. "Leave now. Don't think one good catch gives you any rights." The room fell silent, all eyes on Grace. She stood, her notepad closing with a soft snap, her face calm. "Understood," she said, her voice low. As she walked out, the intern snickered. "Bet she's pulling stuff from night school law classes," he said, his voice carrying. Claire laughed, her heels clicking as she leaned back. Grace's hand paused on the doorframe, her fingers steady before she stepped into the hall, the door closing behind her. Grace didn't return to her desk right away. She slipped into the archive room, its shelves lined with files that held the firm's secrets. Her hands moved quickly, pulling a contract she'd flagged earlier, one with suspicious offshore account numbers. She snapped a photo with her phone, her fingers steady, and sent it to a secure email address labeled Federal Contact. Her glasses caught the dim light as she tucked the phone away, her expression unchanged. Back at her desk, she resumed her work, her pen moving across another contract. No one noticed her absence. No one suspected the quiet woman in the plain blouse was feeding evidence to prosecutors. The office hummed around her, oblivious as she typed, her fingers light but precise, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. As Grace worked at her desk, a group of junior associates gathered near the coffee machine, their voices loud enough to carry. One, a man named Brian with a slicked-back haircut, pointed at her. "Look at her scribbling away like she's saving the world," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's she even writing?" "Her diary." His friends laughed, one spilling coffee as she giggled. "Probably her grocery list," another added, her phone raised to capture Grace's focused expression. The laughter drew eyes from nearby cubicles, heads turning to stare. Grace's pen paused briefly, her glasses glinting as she looked up. "I'm reviewing contracts," she said, her voice steady. Brian grinned, leaning closer. "Contracts. Leave that to the real lawyers, honey." The group's laughter swelled, sharp and cutting, as Grace resumed her work, her fingers steady, her silence a shield. A file clerk named Anna, her badge dangling from a lanyard, approached Grace's desk with a small stack of papers. "Miss Miller," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the office hum, "I found these in the archives. They're from your scholarship program for legal interns." She handed Grace a folder with thank you notes from students, their handwriting messy but heartfelt. Grace took the folder, her fingers brushing the paper, her lips curving slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm. Anna nodded, her eyes bright, and walked away. Brian, still lingering nearby, overheard his smirk fading as he glanced at his friends, who shifted uncomfortably, their coffee cups now still. Grace stood by the copy machine, sorting a stack of documents, when a senior associate named Lauren, her designer handbag slung over her shoulder, approached. "You're in the way," she said, her voice sharp, drawing the attention of nearby staff. "This isn't a place for nobodies to loiter." Her friends, a group of associates with polished nails, laughed, one snapping a photo of Grace's plain outfit. "She looks like she's here to fix the printer." Another said, her voice loud enough to echo. The laughter spread cold and relentless as heads turned to watch. Grace's hands steadied on the documents, her glasses catching the light. "I'm finishing a task," she said, her voice calm but firm. Lauren smirked, adjusting her handbag. "Task. You're wasting everyone's time." Grace stepped aside, her posture straight, but her fingers brushed the edge of her clutch, a quiet anchor. A law librarian named Thomas, his glasses fogged from rushing, approached Grace by the copy machine. "Me." "Miller," he said, his voice low but steady, holding out a worn book. "You requested this case law last month. It helped me teach a class." He smiled, his hands fidgeting. "Your notes were spot on." Grace took the book, her fingers brushing the cover, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm. Thomas nodded and hurried away, ignoring Lauren's group, who exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier laughter fading. The following morning, the office was quieter than usual, the air heavy with tension. Grace sat at her desk, reviewing another contract, when 3 police officers stormed into the legal department. Their badges gleamed under the fluorescence, their steps heavy on the carpet. A director named Paul, his face flushed with anger, pointed at Grace. "Her," he shouted, his voice echoing across the floor. "She hacked our system and leaked internal files." The officers approached, their handcuffs clinking. Grace stood, her hands still, her glasses catching the light. "I haven't hacked anything," she said, her voice calm but firm. The officers didn't pause, cuffing her wrists, as the entire office watched. A co-worker named Sarah, her phone already out, laughed. "Brilliant girl, turned out to be a discount spy," she said, snapping a photo. The laughter spread sharp and cold as Grace was led through the 34th floor lobby, her head high, her steps steady. The lobby was a gauntlet of stares and whispers. Associates paused mid-conversation, their coffee cups frozen in their hands. Partners leaned out of their offices, their eyes narrow. Sarah's photo was already circulating, her caption on X reading, "Caught red-handed at Sterling and Holt." Who knew the quiet girl was a traitor? Grace's flats clicked softly on the marble floor, her clutch tucked under her arm, her face composed. Claire stood by the elevators, her smirk wide. Guess she thought she could play with the big dogs, she said, her voice carrying. The intern beside her laughed, his phone raised. Night school didn't teach her this, he added, sparking more chuckles. Grace didn't respond, her gaze fixed ahead, her silence louder than their taunts. As Grace was led toward the elevators, a junior paralegal named Miguel, his tie slightly askew, approached an officer quietly. Sir, I saw Ms. Miller's work on the merger files, he said, his voice low but steady. She flagged errors no one else caught. She's not a spy. The officer nodded, taking a note, but didn't stop the escort. Grace's eyes met Miguel's for a moment, her expression softening slightly, her glasses glinting. Thank you, she said, her voice barely audible. Miguel stepped back, his hands fidgeting as Claire rolled her eyes nearby. What a hero, she muttered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Grace kept walking, her cuffed hands steady, her silence carrying a weight the room couldn't ignore. Before we go on, let's take a second. If you've ever been judged, laughed at, or pushed aside for no good reason, this one's for you. Grab your phone, hit that like button, leave a comment below about where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel. It means the world to keep telling stories, like Grace's stories about people who don't let the noise stop them. All right, let's get back to it. Grace's walk through the lobby felt endless, the officers' grips firm on her arms. Employees lined the halls, their whispers sharp like knives. A junior associate named Tom, his tie slightly crooked, leaned toward a colleague. Always knew she was shady, he said, his voice loud enough to carry. Who wears slacks like that to a firm like this? His friend, a paralegal, snickered, her phone angled to capture Grace's exit. Probably thought she could scam her way to a promotion, she added, her laugh brittle. Grace's hands cuffed behind her stayed steady, her fingers brushing the edge of her blouse. I'm not a scammer, she said, her voice low but clear. Tom scoffed, rolling his eyes. Sure, tell it to the judge, he said, sparking laughter from the crowd. Grace kept walking, her glasses glinting under the lights, her silence a shield against their scorn. As Grace passed the reception desk, a group of consultants, their briefcases gleaming, gathered nearby. One, a woman named Diane with a sharp bob and a designer coat, called out, Hey, isn't that the girl who messed up the filing system? Her voice carried drawing laughs from her group. She probably thought she could hack her way to a corner office. Another added, his phone raised to record. The laughter swelled cold and relentless as heads turned to watch. Grace's steps didn't falter, her clutch tucked under her arm, her glasses catching the light. I've never touched the filing system, she said, her voice calm but firm. Diane smirked, adjusting her coat. Sure, and I'm the CEO, she said, sparking more laughter. Grace kept moving, her posture straight, but her fingers brushed the edge of her slacks, a quiet tether to her strength. A former intern named Sam, now a junior associate, approached Grace as she neared the elevators. Miss Miller, he said quietly, holding out a small notebook. You helped me with a contract last year. Your notes saved my presentation. He smiled, his hands nervous but steady. I knew you were more than they said. Grace took the notebook, her fingers brushing the pages, her expression softening. Thank you, she said, her voice warm. Sam nodded and stepped back, ignoring Diane's group, who exchanged uneasy glances, their laughter dying as they watched him walk away. 3 weeks later, the firm was unrecognizable. Federal agents swarmed the 34th floor, their jackets marked FBI in bold letters. Employees stood frozen, their laptops open, their faces pale. 5 senior executives, Richard, Margaret, Paul, and 2 others, were led out in handcuffs, their ties askew, their voices silent. Grace stepped out of a black SUV parked outside, no longer in her white blouse and slacks. She wore a sharp black suit, her glasses replaced by contacts, her hair loose. A badge clipped to her belt read Witness Protection, Federal Partner. An officer named Agent Carter, his voice steady, called out to the crowd. Thanks to Mrs. Miller, we now have all the evidence we've been building for the last 2 years. The employees stared, their whispers dying, their phones lowering. Claire, standing by her desk, dropped her pen, her face ashen. The raid was swift, the office turned upside down. Agents seized computers, rifled through files, and taped off conference rooms. Grace stood near the reception desk, her arms crossed, her expression calm. Paul, his hands cuffed, glared at her as he was led past. You were just a damn assistant. He spat, his voice shaking. Grace met his gaze, her eyes steady. I was never just anything, she said, her voice low but cutting. The words landed like a slap, silencing the room. Sarah, her phone still in hand, stared at the floor, her earlier laughter gone. The intern, his blazer now wrinkled, muttered to himself, his face red. Grace didn't linger, her steps measured as she followed Agent Carter to the elevator, her badge catching the light. As the agents continued their sweep, a retired attorney named Harold, his suit slightly worn, approached Grace near the reception desk. Miller, he said, his voice gravelly but warm, holding out a small card. I trained you at Harvard. I knew you were special then. He smiled, his eyes crinkling. You've done what I never could. Grace took the card, her fingers steady, her expression softening. Thank you, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Harold nodded and walked away, ignoring Paul's glare. Sarah nearby overheard her phone slipping into her pocket, her earlier smirk gone. Grace stood by a window watching the agents work when a group of analysts gathered nearby. One, a man named Kevin with a loud tie, pointed at her. She's the one who brought this mess on us, he said, his voice carrying across the floor. What kind of idiot thinks they can sneak around a firm like this? His friends laughed, one snapping a photo of Grace's silhouette against the glass. She's probably some wannabe detective, another added, her voice sharp with scorn. The laughter drew eyes cold and relentless. Grace's hand rested on her badge, her posture steady, her eyes fixed on the city below. I'm just here to finish my work, she said, her voice calm but firm. Kevin scoffed, adjusting his tie. Finish. You've ruined everything. Grace turned away, her steps even, but her fingers brushed the edge of her suit jacket, a quiet anchor. A compliance officer named Emily, her glasses perched on her nose, approached Grace by the window. Miller, she said quietly, holding out a folder. Your audit notes helped us catch a discrepancy last quarter. We didn't know it was you. She smiled, her hands steady. You're why we're cleaning this place up. Grace took the folder, her fingers brushing the paper, her lips curving slightly. Thank you, she said, her voice warm. Emily nodded and walked away, ignoring Kevin's group, who exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier laughter fading. The fallout hit hard. The firm's accounts were frozen, its deals under scrutiny. Employees were ordered to surrender their phones, their salaries paused pending investigation. Claire, her blonde updo slightly frayed, stood by her desk, her voice trembling. What the hell is going on? She said, her eyes darting to Grace's badge. She was just a nobody. Her words hung in the air unanswered. Tom, the junior associate, tried to slip out, but an agent stopped him, demanding his laptop. This is insane, he muttered, his voice shaking. Grace didn't look at him, her focus on a tablet Agent Carter handed her, its screen displaying emails she'd flagged months ago. Her fingers moved across the screen, steady and sure, as the office watched their earlier taunts. Now a bitter memory. Grace's role came into sharp focus in the boardroom where the remaining staff gathered under the watchful eyes of federal agents. She stood at the head of the table, her black suit a stark contrast to the room's glass walls. I came here to expose the rot, she said, her voice clear, unwavering. And now, the game is over. The room was silent, the partners' chairs empty, their nameplates removed. Edward, the lead attorney who'd once nodded at her catch, stared at his hands, his face pale. Sarah, seated in the back, clutched her notepad, her earlier photo, now a liability. Claire's earrings no longer gleamed, her face tight with shock. Grace's words hung in the air, each one a hammer striking the firm's fragile pride. She turned her steps steady, leaving the room in stunned silence. As Grace walked toward the elevator, a young intern named Lily, her badge still new, slipped her a folded note.
Miss
Miller, she whispered, her voice trembling. I saw your notes in the training files. They helped me understand the law better. The note was a simple thank you signed by several interns. Grace took it, her fingers brushing the paper, her lips curving slightly. Thank you, she said, her voice warm. Lily nodded, her eyes bright, and stepped back. Claire nearby overheard her coffee cup trembling in her hand, her earlier confidence gone. Grace paused near the boardroom door, adjusting her badge, when a senior consultant named Mark, his cufflinks gleaming, approached. You've got some nerve standing here like you belong, he said, his voice loud enough to draw eyes. You think you're a hero. You're just a clerk who got lucky. His friends, a group of consultants with polished briefcases, laughed, one recording Grace on his phone. She's probably dreaming of a movie deal, another said, her voice sharp with scorn. The laughter swelled cold and relentless as heads turned to watch. Grace's hand rested on her badge, her posture steady, her eyes fixed on the door. I'm here for the truth, she said, her voice calm but firm. Mark scoffed, adjusting his cufflinks. Truth. You're a nobody who stirred up trouble. Grace walked away, her steps even, but her fingers brushed the edge of her suit, a quiet anchor. A federal auditor named Clara, her briefcase tucked under her arm, approached Grace by the boardroom door. Miller, she said, her voice crisp but warm. Your flagged transactions were key to our case. You saved us months of work. She handed Grace a sealed report, its cover marked with a federal seal. Grace took it, her fingers steady, her expression softening. Thank you, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Clara nodded and walked away, ignoring Mark's group, who exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier laughter dying as they watched her leave. The consequences were brutal but quiet. Richard was fired from the board, his name erased from the firm's website. Claire lost her sponsorship with a luxury brand after her ex-post's mocking Grace went viral for all the wrong reasons. Paul's company stock plummeted, his 1-cent bid a public embarrassment. Sarah's photo, once a smug trophy, became evidence in an internal review, costing her a promotion. The intern, his blazer, now a symbol of his overconfidence, was let go, his resume stained. Grace didn't see any of it. She didn't need to. Her work was done, her silence louder than their apologies. The legal fallout was relentless. The 5 executives faced charges of money laundering and bribery, their trials splashed across headlines. Sterling and Holt's reputation crumbled, its clients fleeing to rival firms. Grace's evidence, emails, contracts, and offshore account details was airtight, the result of 8 months of meticulous work. She didn't gloat, didn't linger on the headlines. Her focus was elsewhere. In a quiet moment, she stood by her desk, now cleared of her belongings, and glanced at the faded photo of her parents. Her fingers brushed the frame, her lips curving slightly. She tucked it into her bag, her movements steady, and walked out, leaving the firm behind. Grace's new office in Washington, D.C. was modest but bright, its windows overlooking the Potomac. She sat at her desk, a member of the National Corporate Ethics Council, her badge now a permanent fixture. A case file lay open in front of her, its pages marked with her precise notes. She glanced at it, her eyes tracing the familiar clauses, then looked up, her gaze settling on the river outside. A small smile crossed her face, quiet but real. She'd done what she came to do. The world had tried to break her, but she'd stood firm. And now she was exactly where she was meant to be. Her silence had always been her strength. The taunts, the cuffs, the laughter. They'd faded, replaced by the truth she'd carried all along. She didn't need to shout it. The world saw it now. And for those who'd been judged, dismissed, or silenced, her story was a quiet promise. You're not alone. Keep going. Your truth will speak. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.